Hello, tea lovers. Welcome to Rebecca's Tea Cozy. I'm your hostess, Rebecca, and I invite you to join me here as we share a love of tea and other things that are cozy. We're starting a new series of Let's Talk Tea, which will focus on all about tea, the basics. In today's episode, we're going to discuss how to brew the perfect cup of tea in 3 simple steps. Now, if that sounds a little too easy for our advanced tea drinkers, I encourage you to stick around and perhaps you can learn a tip or two, or you can hear what I've shared and then add an additional tip in the comments below. For those of you that are novices, I promise you that it really is 3 simple steps to enjoying a perfect cup of tea. So, if you're ready to join me on this journey, let's get started. First, we have to decide who's judging whether or not it's the perfect cup of tea. If you're like me and you've dabbled in trying to figure out how to make a good cup of tea, you've probably researched, looked at articles, tried to find information online, and many of the sites and information that you read can be very daunting. It's all about a perfect experience or the correct temperature, the perfect amount of steeping time, exact measurements of tea, whether it's in weight to the amount of water, whether it's measuring it out. And it can really seem daunting, not to mention all the different varieties of tea that are out there. But we want to zero in on the bottom line, which is who is enjoying and determining and judging whether or not it's the perfect cup of tea. And that, my friend, is you. So it's not about what all the critics say. It's really about what you determine is the perfect cup of tea. So we're going to break it down into 3 simple steps. I will give you a few tips for how to maybe make your tea a little bit more enjoyable. But also let's just talk the basics today. So in order to make the perfect cup of tea, we need 3 things. 1, you need water. 2, you need tea. And 3, you need vessels to heat your water as well as to brew and drink your tea. So let's start with step 1, which is to heat your water. Now, first we want to make sure that we start with a quality water, because whatever water you use to brew your tea is going to impart flavor in your final cup of tea. So if you drink water from a well and perhaps it has a mineral taste, or from the tap, which is a chlorinated taste, then you definitely want to use a different water to drink your cup of tea. So if your water doesn't taste good right from the start, then you probably want to use a filtered water or a bottled water. So you want whatever water you're going to use to taste good in its natural state, because you want your tea not to be influenced by any off tastes or off flavors. Next, you need to decide what you're going to use to heat your tea water in. Now, I use just a simple stove pot and nothing fancy here. I just heat it up with about the amount of water that I'm going to use for my tea, which in this case is enough for about a cup or 2. If I'm drinking tea in the morning and I know I want 3 or 4 cups, then I'll put that much water in. Some of you may have a kettle or a fancy machine that even includes the temperature and it heats it up to the perfect temperature. Great, use it. But don't feel intimidated by all of this equipment that you may not have. You really just need a pot or something to heat water in, and then water. When you think about the first person who drank tea, it was thousands of years ago. They didn't have electricity. So they used very simple, basic ways to heat water. So first of all, when you're heating your water, don't be intimidated by what you may or may not have to do it. Use what you have. It makes your perfect cup of tea. So I'm going to go ahead and get our water boiling. I'll be right back. While our water is heating, let's talk about the temperature of the water. So one of the things that can be daunting is I've heard that there's specific temperatures that you must use, whether you're drinking black tea or green tea or yellow tea or white tea. It just seems very confusing. So how do I manage this? One of the tips and tricks that I use is just thinking very simply. The 2 main types of tea that people drink are black and green. For black teas, you want the water to be a little closer to boiling. For green teas, you want the water to be cooled off a bit. maybe down to 175 degrees, give or take 10 degrees. And that would be about 85 degrees Celsius. Black teas, you want it just below boiling, which might be about 205 degrees, give or take, which is about 96 degrees Celsius. Now, do I use a thermometer and I test my water every time I go to drink a cup of tea? Absolutely not. Again, you want the experience of tea to be enjoyable. Now, there are times when I'm curious and I want to experiment, and I grab my thermometer and I see how it impacts the flavor of the tea, which we will be doing in an upcoming episode. And I encourage you to try some experiments too. But for our general day-to-day purposes, where we just want to be about the process of enjoying tea, then we use ballpark ranges. So you're going to learn a few tips or tricks. There are some simple ways to help gauge what temperature your tea is to make sure that it's right for either a black tea or more intense teas in that family, or more of a lighter tea like green teas or yellows or whites. One tip that I use is starting with a little bit of cool water in my cup when I'm drinking a tea that is on the lighter side, like a green tea. So I put maybe a tenth of cool water in my cup, and then I pour the hot water over top of that. So by the time the water mixes, it's at about the temperature that I need. Another tip is to leave your tea steeping uncovered so that some of the heat escapes. Whereas if I'm drinking a stronger tea, I may choose to cover it to keep the heat inside so that it's steeping at a higher temperature and maintaining that heat. Another tip is to pull the water off of the stove once it's reached the boiling point, and it's said to drop about 5 degrees for every minute that it sits off the heat. And I have tried this, and it was about 5 degrees per minute. So if I heat the water to boiling, I pull it off the stove, and I want it to drop to about 175 degrees for green tea, then I'm going to leave it off for about 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, about 7 minutes or so. And that's a way to roughly gauge. You'll also start to learn when the tea starts to bubble what it looks like at around the 175 degree mark versus, of course, the boiling mark. And for those of you that are interested in really diving into the specific temperatures, we're going to be getting into this a little bit more in an upcoming episode, but I've also provided a link to a chart that you can use to give some guidance on the different types of tea that you may be drinking and the temperature that you should have the water. So why is it important? Well, the different temperatures keep the teas from tasting burned, like a green tea. It brings out a little bit of a bitter flavor in your green teas. And that's one of the reasons I believe that a lot of people don't necessarily enjoy green tea, is because it tastes bitter. And it's really about the temperature of the water that you're using. So when you bring the water temperature down a little bit to a cooler temperature and then pour it over your tea to steep, you might find that you really enjoy that flavor. When you're using a more intense tea like a black tea, if the water isn't a high enough temperature, you don't get all of the flavor out of that tea either. There are sometimes where I've forgotten to reheat my water and it's cooled off, and I go to steep a cup of black tea and it tastes like brown water. It really is not pleasant. And I realized it's because I didn't get it up to the temperature high enough for the water to extract the flavor of the tea. So there is some reasoning in having a temperature that's a little bit more suited to the type of tea that you're drinking. But again, it doesn't have to be a scientific process when you're enjoying an everyday cup of tea. You want it to be an enjoyable, stress-free activity, because that's why we drink tea, is to enjoy it and be comforted by it. So while we're still waiting for the tea to heat, let's move on to step 2. Step 2 is to select a quality tea. Now, the first thing we have to decide is tea bags or loose leaf tea. And we're going to talk about more in depth the pros and cons in the next episode of Let's Talk Tea. But for today's purposes, we're just going to look briefly at tea bags and then the loose leaf tea options. So here I have a tea bag from a company that I trust. And the important thing about selecting a tea bag is making sure that it's from a quality, reputable company. Now, the reason for that is you want to make sure that the tea inside the tea bag is a quality tea and that they're using more of a leaf than the dust that comes from the tea process, where it's all broken up and the leaves are all broken up and what's left is basically a dust. That, sure, it makes your tea water look really dark really quickly, but there's not a lot of quality flavor. And again, if you grew up on a big brand name tea, not naming any names, but a big brand name tea of tea bags, and that's all you've ever had, then I would encourage you to try some other brands that have a little bit higher of a reputation, or loose leaf tea can't be beat. So that can be part of our exploration together as we try some different types of tea that maybe you haven't explored yet. So the other important thing about choosing a quality tea company in tea bag form is because there's a material for the tea bag. And so we want to make sure that not only is the tea a good quality and free of chemicals and pesticides and things that can harm us, but the tea bag itself is made of a material that will be helpful and not harmful. Some tea bag companies bleach their tea bags or use paper that may have other things in them to form the tea bag. And so you want to make sure that you know what you're putting inside your body, because when this tea bag goes in the cup and there's hot water, it's not only extracting the tea, it's extracting what may be in the material of the bag and the string itself. So one of the things that you'll learn besides tea that I'm passionate about is making sure that I take care of my body well, that I only put pure, natural, as close to earth products as I can in their natural form, both inside and outside my body. So anything that we put in our bodies, we want to make sure that it's nourishing and that it's healthy for us. And that's a tall order in our world today. The tea that I drink most frequently is loose leaf tea. And for those of you that haven't moved into the world of loose leaf tea, this may seem a little daunting in and of itself. We'll be again exploring a little bit more about selecting loose leaf teas and how to steep them in an upcoming episode. But for today's purposes, we're just going to talk about some of the basics. So the nice thing about loose leaf teas is if you're choosing a quality company, which isn't necessarily the most expensive tea, but it is a tea with a tea company with a good reputation, then you're going to find that you actually see the leaves and the shape of the leaves, and hence why it's called loose leaf tea. There are a lot of different varieties out there of loose leaf teas. There are some that are just the straight tea, and then there are others that have flavorings or hints of scents such as jasmine, or might have chamomile flowers infused in with the tea, or ginger. So there are many, many varieties on the market. So in order to fix loose leaf tea, you want to measure out the amount of tea that you need, and then you need something to steep the tea in to hold the leaves. Now, some people will put the leaves directly in their mug or in the pot, if it's a stovetop pot, or in a teapot, which is fine if you're going to pour it out immediately and begin drinking it. If it's a tea that's going to get really strong, if it steeps too long, then you don't want those leaves sitting in there because it will turn your tea more of a bitter flavor, become really too strong to drink. I'm personally not somebody who enjoys strong tea, but some people do. So again, this is your perfect cup, so it's up to you. Most people, when they're drinking loose leaf tea, will use some type of steeping tool. So I have a mug, and this is one of my favorite mugs to use. And that's another important part of enjoying your cup of tea, is having mugs and vessels that make you feel happy. Maybe they remind you of somebody. Maybe they remind you of a place that you've been. One of my traditions is whenever I visit a new place, I buy a teacup from that new place. And then whenever I'm drinking from it, it reminds me of a special event or a special time with somebody that I cherish, or maybe it was just myself on a retreat, enjoying and reflecting over a weekend. So this particular mug has a story. my mom and I took a trip to a lavender festival. We stayed at a B&B for the weekend and enjoyed visiting the lavender farm, and hence the lavender flower mug. And I love this set because it includes a saucer, a mug, a cover for steeping, again, to hold in heat. Not necessary, but it's a nice touch. And then also the actual strainer inside. So every time I drink out of it, I think about my time with her. So again, that's one of the things about enjoying a cup of tea, is those memories that you bring to the experience. So we will measure out the tea. Loose leaf tea is a general guideline. If it's a smaller leaf, maybe about a teaspoon per every 8 ounces. If it's a larger leaf tea, it might be up to a tablespoon to 1.5 tablespoons per every 8 ounces. Now, I enjoy drinking multiple cups of tea from the same steeping, so I use a little bit more tea, and that way I can enjoy the same tea that I'm using multiple times in a sitting. So I have a cute little spoon here that's a teaspoon. Again, this is not necessary, but it makes me happy. Use what you have. I've also, once you get to figure out about how much it should be, I a lot of times will just pour it right into my hand and ballpark it. So since I have my little teaspoon right in front of me, I'll use this one. Now this teaspoon in the shape of a teacup is actually the amount of a tablespoon. So when I'm looking for a teaspoon, I use about 1/3 of it. And ballpark that. So I'm going to pour it out and put it into my strainer. And I'm only drinking 1 cup now, so I'm going to do the recommended teaspoon to 8 ounces. Now, a lot of times on the back of the package, you will see the directions, which includes the measurement that you should use per either 8 ounces, or a lot of times it'll say 16 ounces, as well as the temperature that you should heat the water to. So again, they're all ballparks. It is helpful to have the tea recommendations for amount of tea to water and the temperature right from the actual company, because they've probably experimented and have the best recommendation for that particular tea. So the other vessels that you may use besides a teacup with a strainer is you might want to use a teapot. So I have a couple that I use frequently. And again, it depends on how much tea I want to make in a sitting. Sometimes I like to just drink a mug at a time, and then the water sits on the stove heating, staying heated. And that way I'm constantly getting a nice hot cup of tea each time. I also have a single person basically, or about a 2-cup teapot. And the nice thing about this one is it also includes a strainer for loose leaf tea. And I put a little cozy over it, and it keeps it pretty warm the entire time. And this is under $15 to purchase. So it's an inexpensive choice if you don't want to get up and constantly have to refill your mug or reheat water to make sure it's up to temperature. You make 1 small pot. And if you like strong tea, you can leave this in. Or what I do is after I steep, I take this out and then cover it up with a cozy, and it stays nice and hot for me. Another teapot that I use is one that is a little bit larger. Now, don't judge me. Again, we use what we have on hand. And so this one has seen its wear, but it's been loved. It used to have an actual glass cover, but I don't know if you've ever had any glass teapots. I found that I've broken several of the lids off. And so for this one, I actually found a little stainless steel cup that fits perfectly inside the top. Now this one you'll see also has a strainer in it, which is great because then I can steep the tea, pull this out, and then put my makeshift lid back on. Now this one will lose heat quickly, as will a lot of teapots. So if I'm going to be drinking this a larger amount or sharing it with friends over time, then I like to use a tea cozy. I didn't have one that fit this particular teapot because it's a little larger than most of mine, so I improvised. I had a winter fleece hat, and it just happened to fit this teapot perfectly. So it keeps it nice and warm, which makes me happy. Again, use what you have. Don't be intimidated by not having pretty teapots and, all the fancy equipment. It's all about enjoying what's inside with those that you cherish most dearly, whether it's a friend, a family member, or yourself. So those are just a few options in addition to a single mug that you could use if you had them on hand. So I believe our tea water is ready, so I'm going to go grab our pot and I'll be right back. So our water has been heated up to boiling. I've pulled it off the stove, and now we're ready for step number 3, which is to steep your tea. Now with steeping, the biggest thing is, again, the temperature of the water, not necessarily being crazy about the specific temperature, but just knowing that you want it a little closer to boiling for your more intense teas and black teas, and a little lighter of a temperature for your lighter teas, such as green teas. And I have a green tea today. So I'm going to wait a few minutes while we're sharing a little bit more information about steeping before I pour the water over my tea leaves. Now that's an important step, is when you are pouring the water, you want to make sure that your tea leaves or your tea bag are already in the cup. Otherwise, if you pour your water first and then try to set this inside, you can think about or imagine what might happen to the leaves. You guessed it, they all float right up to the top and then you're trying to get them down. With the tea bag, I don't know if somebody's handed you a hot cup of water and then you try to put your tea bag in and it's trying to get it down to the bottom and without burning your fingers. So we recommend that you put your tea into your mug first and then you pour your water on top so that it will all stay submerged and it'll bring out the best flavor. Now, the other thing that you have to decide is steeping time. Again, a lot of times the manufacturer or the tea company will add steeping recommendations for how long you should leave the tea leaves or the tea bag in your mug. But again, this is your perfect cup of tea, and it's important to know what your taste profile is, what you enjoy about tea. I know personally that I'm a tea drinker that does not enjoy strong teas, as I've said. And so I don't want to steep my tea very long. If you are somebody who enjoys a stronger cup of tea, then you may want to leave it in. I have some friends who leave their tea bag in the entire time that they're drinking their tea. That would be way too strong for me. The only time I do that is if I'm drinking an herbal tea for a medicinal purpose, like ginger for my tummy or chamomile to help me relax or go to sleep. So in this case, for smaller leaf teas where it's going to extract it a little more quickly, I may leave it in for 30 seconds and then test it and see if it's looks about right. I might leave it for a minute, up to a minute and a half if it's a larger leaf tea. It's now time to steep our tea. So I'm going to pour the water over the leaves. And again, this is a green tea, so the tea has been sitting off of the heat for a little while, so it's had time to come down to temperature. And I'm going to let it steep again for maybe about 30 seconds or so, and then I'll check to see if it looks about the color that I want. You can put a cover on top to steep your tea and keep the heat in. Again, with green tea, you might want some of that heat to escape if it's on the higher temperature side. It's up to you. One of the things that I do with my tea is I fill it up with a little bit of room at the top because I am not able to drink very hot beverages. I will burn my tongue very easily on a hot beverage or even some hot foods. So it's actually nice. My husband has become my taste tester or my cupbearer, so to speak. If he's around and I've gotten a cup of tea from a cafe or maybe we have some in a thermos, I always let him be my taste tester first because he can tolerate a little bit hotter temperatures of water. And so he's always my taste tester and he's learned what is the perfect temperature for me to enjoy it. And so he tests it and then lets me know when it's ready to drink. If I want to enjoy my tea right away, I leave that room at the top so that I can add a little bit of cool water to it so that it's at a perfect temperature for me. If I know that I'm going to be sitting and enjoying this cup of tea over a longer period of time, then I may fill it to the top and slowly enjoy it as I'm reading a book or working in my journal or having morning devotions or sitting and just enjoying time with a friend or a family member. So it's been steeping for probably about 30 seconds to a minute now. And so I'm just going to pull it out and see if I like the color of the water. And again, you'll learn what the color looks like based on the type of tea that you're drinking and what your preference is. This is another important part of the perfect cup of tea, not what the experts say, but what's a perfect cup of tea for you? I know if I left it in the recommendations of a lot of tea companies, I probably would find that it's way too strong tasting for me. So it's important that you find what your preference is. I find that it's much easier to allow things to steep at a lighter level first, a lesser amount of time, and see what it tastes like. And then the next time, maybe steep it a little bit longer and see if you enjoy it a little bit stronger. It's much easier to go up than to go backwards. However, that being said, another tip is I found that if I've steeped it a little bit too strong, I have two remedies. One is to drink part of it and then just add water, hot water to it to top it off and thin it out a little bit. And my other strategy is to pour some of the strong tea into another mug and then add hot water directly to that one. And again, that will make it less strong. And then I use the strong tea when I'm ready for a second cup. I pour it in and then add the hot water. And that helps me not waste the tea and still enjoy the beverage. You'll notice that I have a little tea bag holder here and most of my strainers will fit on them too. Again, these aren't necessary, but they're a nice little tip to make you feel a little more cozy or just makes me happy. And again, these are things that I pick up sometimes when I'm traveling. If I see some, it reminds me of somebody that I was with or a place that I enjoyed visiting. I also have one at work for my tea bags. And then of course I have several here at home to hold my tea strainers from loose leaf tea. You'll notice that I haven't shared anything about the sweetener. I have not used sweetener in my tea in probably about 10 years or so. And I've learned to enjoy the flavor of the tea that I'm drinking. Now, if you use some of these tips with the water temperature, the length of time steeping, quality teas to start with, quality water, you'll find that you may really enjoy just the cup of tea with no added sweeteners or milk or anything else with it. And I would encourage you, if you haven't tried teas without any sweetener, to try it and see what the flavors are actually like, especially as you become more adept at using some of the tips shared today to make it, to truly enhance the natural flavor of the tea. And then the bonus step that we haven't discussed, there is a bonus step besides the 3 steps, is to enjoy. A nice green tea that has a great flavor without anything added to it. So in today's episode, we talked about brewing the perfect cup of tea in 3 simple steps. Step 1 was to heat your water and making sure that it's a quality water. Step 2 is to select your tea, and again, making sure that it's a quality tea. And step 3 is to steep. And that's where you're steeping it with the temperature of water and the amount of time that will make it the perfect cup of tea for you. I hope that you've enjoyed spending this session of Let's Talk Tea with me today at Rebecca's Tea Cozy. Next week's episode is going to focus a little bit more on teas, whether you should use tea bags or loose leaf teas. What are the pros and cons of each, as well as selecting a quality tea. So I hope that you can join me for our standing reservation for tea right here at Rebecca's Tea Cozy. Until then, be blessed with a cup of tea.